my presentation, and you guys can tell me if you see it or not. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great, thank you. My computer doesn't like Teams. Okay, can you see, what can you see now? Can you see the full screen presentation, or can you see presenters mode?
A city of many worlds.
Okay, can you see that full screen though, or can you see other slides as well?
Full screen.
Full screen, excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so let's get started. So today I'm going to talk to you about my research that I've been working on for the past 4 years, which is part of my PhD. I'm going to start by giving a kind of a short introduction to the topic. Then I'm going to talk about the aims and objectives of this research, so why I'm doing this and why I think it's important. I'm going to give a brief overview of literature that I've used and that I'm using in the research. And then I'm going to go on to talk about a very specific incident, a kind of a zoom in moment of the research. Okay, so my research deals with infrastructures in the general sense, specifically with a tunnel, a car tunnel in the city of Prague in the Czech Republic. This tunnel is called Blanka. It's the longest inner city tunnel in Europe. It took 16 years of planning and construction, and it became the center of numerous disputes and a national controversy across 2 decades. So this tunnel opened to traffic in 2015, but with several billion crowns over budget and a 2-year delay, part 2 of this project, which is called Blanka 2, has already become controversial. So both these tunnels are exclusively for cars. They are part of a larger infrastructure plan, which is a remnant from 1974, a very kind of modernist plan of cutting the city through with highways. Many of those, a number, the plan as it was in 1974 didn't go forward, but many of those aspects, many of those projects, smaller projects of that plan did persist even post 89, post the kind of post-socialist shift. So during the time of its construction, so to give you kind of an idea of why, the tunnel is meant to take on car traffic that normally passes through the city center. So the idea behind it, or the justification behind it, is to take on this traffic that passes through the city center and to provide a bypass. That statement alone has become controversial. And during kind of the construction, during the 15 years of its construction, we see Prague struggle with many aspects, such as its historicity and cultural character, while at the same time being modern and providing mobility for its citizens. So within the struggle, we see a number of breakdowns, negotiations, and a number of actors sort of pulling in different directions. And each of those groups of actors, they become focused on their own interests and, problematized by their own concerns. Some of these are environmental protection, fair mobility for all citizens, the aim of a walkable city, which has become very kind of prominent over the past 10 years, the cost of the project. So the project is financed by the city alone. It's not a federally funded project. to kind of older generation political parties who see the completion of the project as the only way forward. So this is kind of like the political push that persisted from 1974. So why am I doing this research? So the overall aim of the project is to provide a better understanding of infrastructures in the making, so within the process of making that infrastructure, and their relationship to the city. And this is very key. So a number of scholars who deal with infrastructures, either within urban geography, anthropology, and so on, they deal with infrastructure as such, but very few kind of explore what that coexistence and co-evolution is with the city where it's being constructed. So by focusing on the complexities of the Blanca project, the study traces the actors involved in the controversies surrounding its planning and implementation: landowners, government bodies, NGOs, construction companies, also non-human actors such as plans, codes, regulations, and so on. This allows us to unpack the term infrastructure and to redefine it through the very specific number of technologies and processes that enable its function or its dysfunction, as we will see later on. So that's the aim. So when we ask you to think of an aim for your dissertations, this is kind of what we're looking for. So kind of like an overall idea of what this research wants to do. What is the purpose of this research? Now, to move on to the objectives are very specific and measurable. So they focus on key points within the research, and they also state the how. So the three objectives of this research, and this changes throughout there. So my objectives have changed, and they keep changing up until the moment that I submit my dissertation. So the three objectives of this research are to map the controversy of the Blanka Tunnel in Prague by tracing the key intersecting and conflicting concerns of heritage, traffic management, and environmental protection. 2, to follow the making of Blanka as a continuous process of conserving and transforming the city of Prague. This will reveal the negotiations between networks of actors, the ongoing attempts to implement or contest new infrastructural projects in Prague, and the compromises that need to be made for the successful completion of the Blanka project, particularly after the political shift in 1989. And the third one, to trace how the design and technology of the Blanka Tunnel informs the infrastructuring of Prague by documenting the implementation of adopted technical design solutions that respond to the key issues of the controversy, and analyzing how the discursive challenges of the project are translated onto its technical, material level, and vice versa. So now that I'm looking at my objectives, I realize that they need to change again because my research has become even more specific and even more focused on particular aspects of what it is to infrastructure. But this is to kind of give you an idea of what objectives should look like. So these three objectives, they become a lens through which we study what I call the re-infrastructuring of Prague. So while we study the infrastructure itself, we also study the re-infrastructuring of Prague. So this is kind of my first attempt at mapping the key actors, right? So I put the actors in groups, so the different colors, they indicate different groups of actors, whether that's an NGO, whether that is a government body, a local government body, a planning agency, or a non-human actually actor, like promotional posters that were posted across Prague to kind of promote the idea of Blanka Tunnel. And here I also, on the right-hand side, I kind of look at their concerns. So what is the key concern of these groups of actors? I realized that it's quite impossible to detangle these because it was way too much and it was too complex to kind of take all of these on. So how do I start? Where do I begin? I kind of took on as a starting point. I took on these promotional posters that the city was using to promote the infrastructure, and this was quite an interesting point in terms of discourse of the city council. So it says modern and discrete infrastructure is the backbone of every metropolis. And I'm wondering, what does it mean? What does it tell us about the tunnel and its relation to Prague? Or what does it tell us about the transformations of a city and about how infrastructures are made in the context of a city like Prague, a historical city, a kind of famous for its heritage, famous for, with ample sites of UNESCO sites of heritage. So then I leave this to the side and I go back to the literature. I look at, okay, so what do other people say about infrastructures? How do other people tackle infrastructures? So this is a text that you guys already know. It's Splintering Urbanism. We had this reading in one of our seminars. And at this point in 2001, Graham and Marvin claimed that urban studies and their related disciplines have largely failed to treat infrastructure networks as a systemic field of study. But since then, I would say there was an infrastructure boom over the past 10 years. So extensive investigations of infrastructural production and habitation have come to the fore. So this is some of the other literature that I look at. So very important work has emerged in the past 2 decades in the Anglosphere, as well as the Western European context, as a response to issues of unsustainable transportation, urban sprawl, hypermobility, and migration. So here we have John Urry, Mobilities from Sociology, a key text, a seminal text in Mobilities. We have Ole Jensen, Design and Mobilities. He's a scholar. He's actually an urbanist, an urban design scholar. I would say one of the few scholars in urban studies who deal exclusively or more specifically with mobilities. The Global South, excuse me, has also become a point of focus from a more anthropological perspective, primarily on questions of social mobilities in conjunction with infrastructure appropriation, inhabitation, or lack of thereof. And here we have another text which I think we had a look at, Infrastructural Lives of Malik Simone, and this is Roads by Penny Harvey and Hannah Knox, an excellent book on the making of a road in Peru. And they are anthropologists, actually, so they employ ethnographic methods to study their case. But it should be pointed out, in comparison to these kind of stark opposites of the Western world and the Global South, and in no way am I kind of suggesting this divide, but it is suggested through the literature. I think it should be pointed out that infrastructural production remains underrepresented in the post-socialist context. Of course, since I said that 4 years ago, that has also changed. So you kind of need to be up to date in terms of most current literature. So the city of Prague becomes an in-between space, an intersection of EU regulations, as it's part of the EU, and post-socialist heritage, and also a political hybrid of old school socialist planning and new Western European policies. However, my study kind of doesn't try to define Prague through terms associated with the post-socialist city, as that is another field of study. Instead, the specificities related in this project will point to a city that is constantly transforming. So I'm not explicitly calling this a post-socialist part of post-socialist literature. So, what am I taking on from all this literature? And this is just a snapshot, but what am I taking on from all this literature? So I draw on interdisciplinary examples that allow for more nuanced approaches to infrastructures. So instead of seeing infrastructure as an object, I choose to see it as a dynamic relational form that also addresses the importance of material agency. So not only human actors, but materials, and local practices in their production. So we're really kind of focusing on what does it look like within that local practice. And I'll explain what I mean with the example I'm going to give later on. So for example, Harvey and Knox, the book that I showed earlier, follow the engineer, the expert in the production of the Peruvian road, as an actor who holds the role in folding the social and the technical together to produce material rearrangements. That's a lot of jargon there. Don't worry about that. So in their book, the road construction is aimed to be understood as a political act, by focusing on the unpredictability, uncertainty, and the multiplicity of relations that goes into its production. Similarly, I also borrow from geography or urban geography. Pierre Merriman is a brilliant scholar who deals with mobilities and infrastructure making. So he borrows from Deleuze to approach to kind of see mobility as molecular. So he deals with materials a lot, and he suggests that we should examine the practices of infrastructuring, so the process of making that infrastructure. This allows us to see infrastructure as something that is always in flux, that's never finished, that's constantly ongoing, whether that has to do with the production itself, whether that has to do with maintenance later on, with material decay, and so on. Second point, this also allows us to see infrastructure as not only happening in space and time, but also producing space and time. So it kind of reproduces the space around it. So this is kind of the literature. So here you see kind of the mini literature review that I gave you, to see where I'm coming from. Epistemologically, ontologically, where I'm coming from, what my understanding is of infrastructures inspired by these authors. So starting from this, I focus on the complexities of this project of the Blanca Tunnel through a pragmatist approach and mobilizing ANT methodology, actor network theory. What that means that I trace the different actors in this project, and I see it as a network. So both human and non-human actors that kind of move and work and influence this project, and evolve along with the network that surrounds the project. I'm not going to go too much into this theory. I think that might not be useful to you, but basically this method or this approach shifts the question from what is the city to how does the city work. So we begin to see the how does the city work, and how can we unfold this more specifically. So in order to do that, I use a method called mapping controversies. And we can talk about that. If any of you are interested in what that means and how that works, we can talk about that. It's called mapping controversies in architecture. And I start tracing the different actors that I spoke about and their key concerns through documents that relate to the Blanca Tunnel reports, so engineers' reports, planning documents, websites, newspaper articles. All of these documents, basically, I collect and I analyze to see. So this is a span of 15 years. So there's a lot of documents. So you can't actually like go into each one and see what's in there. You can kind of browse through them, but you can't really take all of these documents and really analyze them one by one. So what I do is I collect all of these. I put them in a kind of a program called Cortext. This is an online platform that allows you to input text, and what it does, it spits out word maps. So these are two of the word maps that I created. And what it does, it produces these different clusters. So you see the different color clusters. So for example, the map on the left is a map that is produced with the use of articles from one of the major newspapers in the Czech Republic between the years 2008 and 2018. And we can zoom in then. So these are keywords. So these are the words that appear most frequently in those newspaper articles, right? So I try to zoom in then on this, and I look at the different clusters. So what does it say here? What are the keywords that appear in this map? So these moments are kind of what I call, or what other scholars have called, infrastructural visibility. And these are kind of critical moments during the construction of the project. And this is where the controversy can be found. So for example, if I zoom in here and I zoom in a little bit more, I'll see terms such as Metrostav, which is one of the construction companies that was responsible for the project, appearing next to the phrase, "the court has decided." If I go back to the article, the original article where this keyword was extracted from, I can find that this connection relates to an incident in December 2013 when the construction company halted all work on the tunnel after the city of Prague refused to pay 2.1 million crowns in disputed invoices. The dispute was resolved through a court arbitration and construction resumed. Further connections to ČKD Praha, which is another construction company involved in the project, and the word cables reveals that in March 2015, Metrostav had offered to take over the technological part of the construction after the project had been postponed indefinitely, when hundreds of kilometers of electric cables were damaged by water and needed replacing. So here you already have two mini controversies within the overall project. Here is another cluster. So when I zoom in and I have a look at what that's about, the cluster reveals an incident in May 2008 when the ceiling of the tunnel collapsed. A massive crater appeared in the grounds of a protected park, of one of the major parks in the city of Prague, and newspapers, of course, rushed to cover the topic. So here we see some of the headlines of major newspapers in Prague. And I'm sorry, they're in Czech, so I'm going to translate. So it says, "Bad luck or conspiracy," the title reads. "On the day that 5 European cities signed the memorandum for the protection of parks, the ground collapsed in Prague's most famous one." Another newspaper reports, "Massive crater buries the Blanka tunnel. The mayor has filed a criminal complaint. The diameter of the hole has reached 30 meters. Sorry, these are not meant to be here. The presentation has messed up my... Right, so let's go here. So the park, the specific park where the tunnel collapsed, has actually been subject of protest since the 1980s. The ring road was meant to pass through it in the 1980s, disrupting the park. So the key concerns that come out of these mini controversies are then cross-referenced in interviews with the engineers, with with NGOs, with non-government organizations, with citizens, active citizens who kind of protested against the project. So I did about 30 interviews with different actors. So the moments that I found in the in this mapping process, I then kind of cross-reference with the different groups of actors to kind of triangulate my data and to kind of expand on these moments of infrastructural visibility. So here, sorry, for some reason My slides are a bit messed up. Anyway, let's try to work with that. So to go back to the collapse, and this is kind of the key moment that I want to talk about in this presentation. So after giving an overview to you guys, this is one of the moments of that infrastructure visibility that I talked about, that I focus on in one of my chapters. So when I spoke to an engineer, to one of the kind of the head engineers of the construction company about this, and I asked him to explain what this moment was about, because it became a huge controversy. The city, the mayor, wanted to sue the company for endangering citizens. So the engineer confirms this collapse as a kind of a critical point. And he explains that they had two constraints that proved very difficult to tackle. One, there was no entry condition into the park. Whatever they did, they had to do it from underground. So they had to dig the tunnel from underground. They couldn't kind of like, go from the top and dig through. And there was no way, because of this constraint, there was no way that they could control the soil from down there. The second constraint was a traffic junction they had to reach in matter of a few hundred meters in distance. So they had to maximize the possible incline of the tunnel as much as regulations allowed in order to reach ground level at that particular junction. And I think I should have a slide here that explains that better. Yes, there we go. No, that's afterwards. But anyway, they had to basically create like an incline in order for the tunnel to kind of reach ground level at a particular junction. So that made conditions even more difficult. So he says, you can imagine when you have an 11-meter hole in diameter, which is the tunnel, above your head you have 1.5 meters of rock, and above that you have 15 meters of watery gravel. Then you're kind of reaching the limit of the technology we're capable of using. However, despite kind of like the technological explanation that the engineer was giving, the stakeholders, the city, therefore the city council, are looking for the persons to be held accountable. The company responsible for the mining technology already knows that they will have to provide answers, most possibly in court. So as the newspapers dig for answers, there's one particular actor that is not being taken into account: the soil, the very material that needs to be held in place in order for the tunnel to pass under it. However, the story of the soil is not recent, as it goes back many thousands of years when the park was at the bottom of the river. So this is actually the soil in that particular location, and in Prague in general, because Prague used to be essentially large parts of Prague used to be under a river. So the soil is kind of soft and crumbly, and it used to be the riverbed. So how is this meant to be held together when a massive tunnel is being dug under it? So the soil holding its past through its current properties reacts to the engineer's efforts to break ground. It talks back, it resists, and finally it gives way. Its reaction not only causes an immediate effect, but one that ripples through the ongoing events of the making of the Blanket Tunnel. Without being mentioned by name, it becomes a headline and a center of discussions in a game of blame that will go on for years to come. It becomes subject to legal procedures as a construction company has to answer in court as to why the soil acted the way it did. After a second collapse, so there were 3 collapses actually of the tunnel, a few months apart, the city bypasses the no entry rule to the park. So the engineers are now able to go into the park and dig from the top, which is what you see in this slide. As the engineer describes, the park becomes a site that resembles the depths of Mordor from Lord of the Rings. concrete flying everywhere and men covered in it walking around a giant hole. The sacred park was injected with concrete after all, disrupting its untouched nature. So what these examples do, or what this example does, is to bring a cosmopolitical argument to the forefront. The making of the tunnel is not only a question of politics, of environment, or techniques. It's a complex process where all these worlds, the political, the environmental, and the technical, intersect and collide in different instances, at different dimensions, and at various speeds. Analyzing the making of a large infrastructure project, therefore, is not possible by excluding one of the aspects and focusing on others, as they so often overlap at these critical moments. The technical difficulty of preserving historically significant buildings from the tunnel's vibrations becomes a highly politicized matter, for example, as the residents themselves seek help with their local representation. That's another moment that was key in the making of the tunnel. So, the story is not about assigning blame. It's not about finding who's responsible. That's the job of the court. The story is about recognizing that there's not one objective definition of a controversy that everyone agrees on. We need to account for a so-called active participation of all the experts and non-experts, whose practice actively engages with the multiple modes of the controversy in question and with the multiple modes of Prague. This becomes essential to kind of avoiding a form of politics that gives voice to clearly defined interests. It stops us from kind of rushing to assign blame, and instead it visualizes the specificities of these conflicts. Here, the soil becomes an actor in the story. It becomes active. It is active in the story. And it's important to acknowledge that, to acknowledge its existence and to acknowledge its role in city making. So what the analysis of this moment does is to reveal a tunnel of many worlds, as I call it, and as is the name of this presentation. Here we see that the sphere of expertise of the experts kind of collides with the physical properties of the soil, and it breaks down. And the political sphere contradicts the experts' technological certainties. So the making of this tunnel brings these conflicting spheres together and allows us to see the many versions of Prague as we unfold this process. So what it also does, it unfolds this non-linear process that is city making and that is infrastructure making, that only succeeds through a number of failures and a number of compromises. And it is through these kind of critical moments of infrastructuring that we can begin to understand this multiverse of the tunnel that brings all of these together and allows us to see how Prague is remade along with the making of this tunnel. Okay. I'm going to leave it at that. Apologies for the mixed up slides. I think it's because I tried to convert my PDF to a PowerPoint so that I could present here, and I think something happened with the slides. So apologies for that. I'm going to open the floor for questions.
Hi, Demetra. Good morning.
Hi.
Can I ask, on behalf of the students, maybe, how having gone through the process yourself and now approaching your towards the end of your PhD, what would be your advice for students when they're starting to put together a research proposal?
Right. So, wow. Okay. Find something that's interesting to you. Find something that you would like to dig deep into. I would say don't settle with something that you're not that passionate about. I mean, that's most certainly true doing a PhD because it's a very, very long project, and it's, it takes you really have to be in love with it in order to do it. At least in my experience. But I would say definitely choose something that you're passionate about. At the same time, don't be afraid to explore different avenues when it comes to that particular project. So we begin with an idea in our head, but that often changes, or most often changes, and takes on a slightly different direction, or maybe an entirely different direction. So, that initial idea is never going to see the end of it as it started. It's going to transform, and you're going to, explore different things that, kind of lead to sometimes completely different conclusions that you had in mind originally. So don't be afraid to explore different avenues and different ways of looking at things, different methods of exploring things. So I found that ethnographically inspired methods are key when it comes to really exploring something in depth. And we have anthropology to thank for that. Yeah. What else? Try to think of why is this important. So a key thing about research is to really kind of try to figure out, okay, so why am I doing this? Why is this important? Why is this important to knowledge, and why is this important to me? How does it help us understand something differently from a different perspective? Yeah.
That's great advice. Thanks, Demetra. I think absolutely reiterate this about trying to find a topic that you're really motivated by. Even for your master's dissertation, it's such a kind of individual project, and it's really important that it's an itch you want to scratch. It's got to be something that you really, really want to find out about to keep your interest for those months.
Yeah. And also don't be afraid to explore literature in other fields. Like I kind of really went out and went in like deep into anthropology and geography and other related disciplines, and found out that these people have been talking about this for the past 25 years, which architecture hasn't recognized, or urban studies haven't recognized, really. So yeah.
Hello, good morning. Hi, just want to ask a question after you explain all your process, your studies. So I've seen that you you have actually collect a lot of like a bibliography, like the books that you have read which inspired you. So which is happens to everyone. We need to do a lot of readings. But I have a question about whether when you're reading those articles or the books that actually were talking about something that maybe a little bit related what you actually interested of, or something that not that much related, but you know could be. So how do you how could you actually using these materials to define what your way? For example, you were talking about the black tunnels, but the other books was kind of like a vast topic, or looking even more like on a topper level of how the infrastructure being in the discussion of the other books. So how actually do you narrow down or really defines the path that actually this book was being useful to your subject, sort of like that talk?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. So I would say that the purpose of the literature review is twofold. One is to kind of locate a gap, to say, and that's not necessarily something that we're going to ask you to do because you don't really do that in a master's dissertation, but to see what other people have written about your topic in terms of your topic, and to find that niche gap that, you know, oh, this is the thing that's missing that hasn't been set up to now, and that's my kind of contribution, which is becoming increasingly difficult, to be honest. But what I did is kind of, okay, so I'm dealing with infrastructure. So I started with a kind of a vast number of books, right? All of these people writing about infrastructures. So I started by placing them chronologically and kind of thematically, in terms of when they were written and their kind of literally context, and in terms of themes, so how they approach infrastructure. So I found that in architecture, for example, we have kind of texts from 50s, 60s, 70s with authors who talk about infrastructure as in terms of roads and in terms of how you experience the road and how you experience the city when you're a driver, right? So that was kind of one theme that I identified. That's something that I wasn't interested in. I wasn't interested in sort of the phenomenological approach. I wasn't interested in looking at the experience of infrastructure. I was looking at the making of infrastructure and the process within it. So that was like, okay, so that's a group. So I take that into account, but I put that aside. Then I found other books that talked about the specificities of the process, the specificities of the technologies, for example, that was used in infrastructure, like in anthropology. These authors would go out, do, you know, in-depth ethnographic studies. They would spend 2 years with engineers and like really look at how those engineers negotiated the different aspects of making infrastructure. And it's kind of like what sparked my interest also, what I thought was an interesting approach, what I thought was an interesting perspective, and an interesting contribution to the field as well. So when I came across Penny Harvey and Hannah Knox's book on roads, it gave me this kick. It gave me this inspiration. I was like, oh yes, this is really interesting, because this gives us something else. This really kind of digs deep into the process and looks at how does the engineer negotiate with the planner when that critical moment of infrastructural failure appears. So I started kind of singling out authors who essentially spoke to me, who I thought had really interesting approaches, and I took those on. Of course, I'm not going to do exactly what they did. I'm kind of going to take inspiration from their approach and from their kind of theoretical, understanding of the topic. and I'm going to say, right, so this is my inspiration. This is what I'm taking on here. And I'm using, or it might be a method that someone is using. Of course, my supervisor was great help in this sense as well, because, you know, when you're starting with this vast, you know, sea of literature, you don't really know where to grasp. So the supervisor also suggests different books, and they say you might want to look at this, or you might want to look at this. You know, of course, as a more experienced scholar, they can do that. So I would say it's a combination of you kind of exploring and finding what sparks your interest in terms of approach and in terms of methodology, and also your supervisor kind of guiding you through this process. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Yeah. Actually, I'm also going through this kind of process, dealing with many of readings and what actually works for me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you for listening.
Hi, Dimitra.
Hi.
I want to ask you about you show in your presentation one list of actors. This actor had some concerns, and you showed 20 groups, different groups, the councils and citizen. How do you define these actors?
Right. So I began by collecting different documents. Mm-hmm. In many instances, these documents that relate to the Blanca project, they were available online through, so for example, I knew from newspapers, so because it became a controversy, there were so many different newspaper articles that spoke about this, right? So from the newspaper articles, I started collecting different names of construction companies, of the mayors that came and went, essentially, because it was a long project. So, you know, it was kind of 3 or 4 mayors during that time. Different non-government organizations that protested against the project. So I started collecting different names. I looked at government reports that were available online. I looked at technical documents that were provided by the construction companies. The newspaper articles, of course, were a key source. Also, one of the NGOs, and this was very, very lucky. This was like really a great source of information. So one of the NGOs, the NGO is called Automat, and it's a relatively new group. And their purpose is to kind of mobilize citizens to advocate for a car-free city. Mm-hmm. So they kind of push for cycling. They really contested the project. They didn't want it to go through, and they created an online archive of different documents. So that was very helpful as well.
Yeah, I think it could be really helpful related to the controversial things, because you can find more information on or different point of view about your research.
Okay. Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. another thing that I would say is don't expect to find all the answers from the beginning. Watching a presentation of a research project that's almost done can be a bit daunting and a bit intimidating when you're at the beginning. But it's a process, and it's an ongoing process, and that is also true for writing as well. So if you're kind of afraid of the writing process, I would say remember or try to think of it as a design project, in the sense, not that it is a design project, but in the sense that you don't suddenly wake up and draw a finished plan. You start with a draft. You start with very basic ideas, and you draw lines and you draw boxes and you kind of sketch, concept ideas, very, very rough ones that you might throw out later. And the same goes for a research project. The same goes for a dissertation. It's an ongoing process that needs to start kind of slowly. It needs to start from somewhere and then develop. And the same goes for your writing. So you write something, you come back to it a week later, you realize that I don't really like this. You kind of change it, you scrap it, you rewrite it, and that's okay. Writing is not easy. It's not meant to be easy. And I like to compare it to design project because it is this back and forth process. It's never a linear process where you start writing and then you continue and you finish. It's very similar to trying to put together a design where you start with a draft, you don't like it, you throw it away, you do something else. You work on that, you say, okay, this works, and you find different iterations of that project. The same goes for writing. It's definitely not a linear process. So, and I think that most people struggle with it. I've never met a researcher who doesn't struggle with writing. So don't be intimidated by it. We will help you work through it, and we will help you kind of develop your ideas. So you're not on your own in this. Any other questions, you guys? Anything at all? Anything that you didn't understand? Anything that didn't make sense? It could be a question about your own project. My computer doesn't like Teams. It's flying away. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I'm going to wrap up here. I think our next guest presents at 11:15, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to leave this here. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for your questions. And I will see you guys later.